You will regret this! I will find every last one of you who did this and make you pay! Ambush! Return fire now! Boss, incoming from the left. Take cover! Take cover! 죽여! 다 죽여버려! Return fire immediately! Secure the perimeter! Don't let them through! Ambush! Take them out! Don't let anyone escape! You will pay for this! Kill them all! Nobody touches my family!
The search took barely 10 minutes to turn the city into a graveyard. 10 minutes that curdled the morning air, silenced the rhythmic pulse of the financial district, and transformed the high-security gala into a crime scene that could never be erased. Kang Jae-hyuk felt the change instantly. The atmosphere in the grand ballroom grew heavy and static, as if the golden chandeliers were closing in to bury them all. He had barely found the empty chair where his daughter, Saran, had been sitting before the world stopped moving. He stood there, a sharp-suited monolith of iron and desperation, his body casting a long, dark shadow over a discarded yellow toy truck. He was a man who had survived decades in a world of wolves by being the apex predator. But as his eyes locked onto the toy, a bright, plastic contrast to the blood-slicked marble, the man of stone cracked. His presence was suffocating, shoulders squared like a fortress, hands large and scarred, resting on his handgun with a weight that suggested he owned every soul beneath the city skyline. It was a terrifying, raw power, the kind that didn't need to shout to signal a death sentence, yet in this moment, his voice was a visceral roar of emotional defiance. If this opening gripped your soul, smash that like button and share this story of ultimate loyalty. Subscribe and hit the bell. The grand ballroom of the Solaris Hotel was still choked with the scent of expensive lilies and ozone, but the music had died a jagged death. Kang Jae-hyuk stood at the center of the devastation, a man who had become the eye of a silent, swirling storm. His black suit, usually a masterpiece of sharp tailoring, was disheveled, the tie loosened like a noose, the jacket stained with the dust of a broken empire. In his hand, the heavy weight of a customized semi-automatic felt like a natural extension of his arm, though his thumb brushed the safety with a rhythmic, anxious twitch that betrayed the strategist's calculated calm. Around him, the air hummed with the clinical efficiency of his tactical vanguard. To his left, the lead rifleman remained anchored behind a pile of marble rubble, his eyes narrowed behind high-tech optics, scanning the perimeter for any shadow that dared to move. To the right, two men in identical charcoal suits moved in a staggered, lethal dance, their rifles leveled with a terrifying, professional stillness. They were the wall Jae-hyuk had built to keep the world out, yet now, that wall felt like a cage. Clear, the lead rifleman barked, his voice a gravelly rasp that failed to pierce the ringing in Jae-hyuk's ears. Jae-hyuk didn't answer. His gaze was anchored to the floor, where the golden light of the chandeliers caught the vibrant, mocking plastic of a yellow toy truck. It sat perfectly upright amidst a field of shattered crystal and brass shell casings. Just 10 minutes ago, Saran had been pushing that truck across the silk tablecloth of the VIP station, her laughter a soft melody that Jae-hyuk had foolishly believed he could protect forever. Now, the table was splintered wood, the silk was shredded, and the only thing left of his 5-year-old daughter was the silence she had left behind. A low, rhythmic thrum began to vibrate in Jae-hyuk's chest before he heard it, the ominous beat of a Black Hawk helicopter hovering directly over the skylight. The downwash rattled the remaining glass in the window frames, sending a rain of diamond dust shards onto his shoulders. His lieutenants looked up, their faces tightening as the higher power arrived to witness their failure. But Jae-hyuk didn't look at the sky. He looked at the toy truck, his chest heaving as the man of stone began to fracture. A raw, visceral roar tore from his throat, a sound that wasn't a command or a threat, but the agonizing cry of a father realizing that the city he ruled had just become his daughter's tomb. The war had begun, and he was ready to burn every street to the ground to find the light he had lost. The heavy steel doors of the syndicate's boardroom didn't just open, they were kicked into the wall with a violence that made the crystal decanters on the side table shiver. Kang Jae-hyuk entered like a fever. He had discarded his suit jacket entirely, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with tension, and his tie hung loose, a fraying leash for a man who had finally slipped his collar. The three regional bosses already seated, men who usually commanded the city's ports and dark alleys, froze, their hands hovering near hidden holsters. This was supposed to be a business reconciliation, a necessary protocol to address the sudden disruption at the gala, but the man standing before them was no longer a businessman. Jae-hyuk, sit, the eldest boss began, his voice a smooth, practiced rasp of authority. We need to discuss the logistical fallout of the... The word was cut short as Jae-hyuk slammed his fist onto the mahogany table, the sound echoing like a gunshot. He didn't sit. Instead, he leaned over the table, his face inches from the elder, his eyes wide and shimmering with a raw, vocal roar of defiance. Logistics? You want to talk about cargo and percentages while my daughter is breathing the air of abasement? He reached into his pocket and pulled out the yellow toy truck, slamming it down beside a stack of profit ledgers. This is the only ledger that matters today. The atmosphere in the room turned heavy and static, the air thick with the scent of ozone and the unspoken threat of the enraged strategist. To the regional bosses, this display of paternal agony was a structural failure, a breach in the monolith of iron they had agreed to follow. They saw a liability. Jae-hyuk saw a pack of wolves who had forgotten who owned the forest. I know the gala's security was breached from the inside, Jae-hyuk whispered, his voice dropping into a terrifying, quiet vibration that was more lethal than a scream. He moved behind the youngest boss, placing a large, scarred hand on the man's shoulder. The weight was suffocating, suggesting he owned the ground beneath the building. Protocol says I wait for a report. Interrogation says I find the leak before the sun sets. With a fluid, clinical motion, Jae-hyuk drew his handgun and laid it flat on the table, the muzzle pointed directly at the center of the room. He wasn't giving orders, he was offering a final confession before the city turned into a graveyard. The business meeting is over. The interrogation has begun. Tell me who took Saran, or I start burning the docks with you still on them. The man of stone had fractured, and through the cracks, a monster of pure, desperate love was finally looking out. The lead rifleman adjusted his grip on the cold steel of his weapon, his eyes never leaving the thermal sweep of the corridor, but his mind was focused on the unnatural silence emanating from the man he was sworn to protect. To the flanking vanguard, the world was composed of angles, trajectories, and clinical efficiency. They were the wall, a synchronized formation of charcoal suits and staggered movements designed to neutralize threats with the precision of a surgical strike. But as they stood witness to Kang Jae-hyuk's transformation, the rigid professional contrast of their world began to fracture. They didn't see a strategist anymore, they saw a breach in the fortress. Status, the advanced team lead murmured into his comms, his voice a flat, robotic drone that betrayed no emotion. He watched Jae-hyuk from the periphery, noting the disheveled suit and the way the boss clutched the yellow toy truck as if it were a holy relic. To a man trained to value iron logic over flesh and blood, Jae-hyuk's raw, emotional defiance wasn't a sign of strength, it was a structural failure. In the high-stakes architecture of the underworld, a leader who screamed at the sky was a leader who had invited the daggers of his rivals. The vanguard moved with a synchronized posture, their boots barely whispering against the debris-strewn floor, providing a professional shield for a man who seemed intent on walking directly into the fire. They saw the environmental characters of the scene, the ominous thrum of the helicopter above and the charred remains of the gala, as tactical variables to be managed. But Jae-hyuk was treating them as personal insults. Every time he broke protocol to bark a desperate question or ignore a security perimeter, the wall felt a new crack form. They had been forged in a syndicate that functioned like a machine, where the boss was the cold, calculating brain. Now, that brain was flooded with the heartbreaking contrast of a father's grief, and the machine was beginning to grind its gears. The soldiers traded a single, clinical glance. They were still his shield, still his vanguard, but for the first time, they weren't just looking for enemies in the shadows. They were looking at the man in the center of the storm, wondering if the era of the monster was being replaced by something far more dangerous, a man with nothing left to lose and a heart that had finally started to beat. To the vanguard, a monster was predictable, a father was a war zone they hadn't been trained to survive. The sky above the city didn't just darken, it groaned under the weight of a power that made even the syndicate's fury seem small. The rhythmic, bone-shaking pulse of the Black Hawk helicopter intensified, its downwash screaming through the jagged remains of the boardroom windows. It hovered like an unblinking eye, a mechanical predator silhouetted against the bruised purple of the twilight sky. Kang Jae-hyuk didn't flinch as the wind whipped his loosened tie against his throat or sent his discarded profit ledgers spiraling into the corners of the room like dying white birds. He simply looked up, his gaze meeting the cold, tinted glass of the cockpit. This was the higher power. For years, the syndicate had operated in the shadows of the city's concrete veins, a silent machine that the government chose to ignore as long as the blood stayed off the main streets. But Jae-hyuk's raw, emotional defiance had changed the math. By turning the city into a war zone for the sake of a 5-year-old girl, he had pulled the curtain back too far. The helicopter wasn't there to assist in the search or to provide air support for his vanguard, it was there to witness the moment the sovereign became a liability. It was a sign that the conflict was no longer a street-level shootout, it was a national emergency. "They're painting us with infrared," the lead rifleman reported, his voice tight with a rare flicker of genuine concern. He didn't look at the boss, he looked at the laser dots dancing across the mahogany table, skittering over the yellow toy truck like neon insects. "If we move on the docks now, we aren't just fighting rival families. We're fighting the state." Jae-hyuk gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white and scarred. He could feel the suffocating presence of the surveillance, an inescapable weight that suggested he no longer owned the ground beneath his feet. The government was no longer a ghost in the machine, they were active participants in the chaos he had unleashed. To his flanking vanguard, the helicopter represented an ultimate tactical checkmate, a reason to retreat, to regroup, to return to the clinical efficiency of the shadows. But as the spotlight from the belly of the craft cut through the dust-choked air, illuminating Jae-hyuk in a harsh, unforgiving white, he didn't reach for his radio to call off the strike. He reached for the yellow toy truck and tucked it firmly into his waistband. If the world was watching, then he would give them a show. He would show them what happens when a monolith of iron is pushed to his absolute limit. The era of the monster was being scrutinized by the highest powers in the land, and Jae-hyuk welcomed the light. If the government wanted to watch a war, he would ensure they didn't miss a single spark. The rain of glass and the roar of the rotors faded into a dull, distant thrum as Kang Jae-hyuk stepped out of the spotlight and into the visceral darkness of the hotel's rear loading dock. His boots crunched over spent brass and dried blood, but his eyes were fixed on the small, jolting splash of yellow resting against a rusted shipping container. He knelt, the joints of his expensive trousers straining, and reached out with a hand that had broken bones and signed death warrants. As his fingers brushed the cold, matte plastic of the toy truck, the war zone around him vanished, swallowed by the ghost of a sun-drenched Saturday 3 months ago. He remembered the bell chiming over the door of that small, boutique toy shop, a place far removed from the cold steel and tinted glass of his usual world. He had been in his full armor then, too, a 3-piece suit, 2 armed guards at the door, and a mind occupied by a hostile takeover of the northern shipping routes. Saran had tugged at his hand, her small fingers warm and sticky with candy, pulling him toward a shelf that smelled of cedar and new paint. She hadn't wanted the elaborate dolls or the digital tablets, she had pointed a tiny, determined finger at a simple yellow truck. For the garden, Appa, she had whispered, her eyes wide with a purity that always made him feel like a trespasser in his own home. So I can carry the stones away and make a castle for you. He had laughed then, a rare, genuine sound that had startled his own shadow. He remembered the weight of the box in his hand, the way he had ignored his ringing phone to watch her hug the plastic toy to her chest. It was the first time he had consciously chosen a child's whim over a syndicate's demand. He had bought it not just as a gift, but as a promise, a silent vow that the world of concrete and shadows would never touch the garden where she built her castles. The memory shattered as a drop of oil dripped from the container above, landing on the yellow roof of the truck like a black tear. Jae-hyuk's grip tightened until the plastic groaned. The promise was broken. The garden was gone, replaced by this cold, oil-slicked labyrinth of iron. He stood up, the toy truck disappearing into the pocket of his shirt, resting right over his heart. The man of stone didn't just fracture, he transformed. The strategist was gone, replaced by a man who finally understood the price of his empire. Every stone he had laid to build his throne had been taken from the walls of her sanctuary. He turned back toward his vanguard, his expression no longer one of raw defiance, but of a terrifying, focused clarity. He didn't just want her back, he wanted to burn the world that had dared to make a toy truck into evidence of a crime. The city didn't just burn, it bled light and fire into the humid night air. With the absolute sovereign of the underworld distracted by a ghost and a toy truck, the delicate equilibrium of the criminal ecosystem collapsed. Rival syndicates, sensing the scent of a wounded king, emerged from the periphery like jackals at the edge of a dying campfire. Streets that had once been governed by the silent, predictable fear of Kang Jae-hyuk were now lawless corridors of chaos. In the northern districts, the warehouse district went up in a plume of oily black smoke, and in the neon-drenched center, the sound of rhythmic gunfire replaced the pulse of the nightlife. Jae-hyuk stood on the rooftop of a parking garage, his white shirt now smeared with soot and oil, looking out over the urban war zone he had inadvertently authored. Every explosion that rocked the horizon felt like a physical blow to his chest, a reminder that his singular focus on Saran was dismantling the very order that had kept her safe for 5 years. He was the eye of the storm, but the storm was growing teeth. Below him, his flanking vanguard maintained their rigid, professional contrast to the surrounding madness. They occupied the corners of the garage with clinical efficiency, their muzzles trained on the stairwells and ramps. But even they could feel the shift. The lead rifleman checked his thermal scanner, his face illuminated by a sudden orange flare from a nearby block. To them, the city in flames was a tactical nightmare, a multi-front war with no clear objective other than survival. They looked at Jae-hyuk's back, at the way his shoulders were squared like a fortress against the heat of the fire, and they saw a man who was no longer calculating risk. He was merely counting the seconds until he found her. The higher power remained above, the helicopter spotlight cutting through the thick smoke, but even the state's intervention felt secondary to the street-level carnage. Rival gangs weren't just fighting for territory anymore, they were fighting to see who could claim the crown from the man who had traded his iron crown for a child's toy. Jae-hyuk gripped the concrete railing, the stone biting into his palms. He could hear the sirens and the screams, a terrifying, quiet power in the distance that was slowly becoming a roar. He didn't care about the ports. He didn't care about the lost millions. He watched the flames and saw only the reflection of the fire he was willing to carry into the heart of the city to get her back. If the streets had to become a battlefield for him to hear her voice again, he would ensure that by dawn, there would be no one left to oppose him. The search had turned the city into a graveyard, and Jae-hyuk was the only one still walking among the tombstones. The cold, mechanical rhythm of the city's burning heart was mirrored in the glowing screens of the tactical hub, but the air inside the armored command vehicle was suffocating. Kang Jae-hyuk sat in the dim, blue light, his face a landscape of shadows and sharp, jagged focus. He wasn't looking at the chaos on the streets anymore. He was looking at a data trail, a series of encrypted pings that had originated from within his own wall during the 10 minutes the world had stopped at the gala. Beside his keyboard, the yellow toy truck sat like a silent judge, its bright plastic a heartbreaking contrast to the cold glass and steel surrounding it. The lead rifleman stood at the rear, his posture a rigid, professional shield, but the two men of the advance team, the staggered formation that had always been his clinical, synchronized vanguard, remained near the door. For the first time, Jae-hyuk didn't see them as his protectors. He saw them as environmental characters, in a play he hadn't realized he was starring in. The gala's security didn't just fail, Jae-hyuk said, his voice a low, terrifying vibration that seemed to curdle the static hum of the radio. It was dismantled. By someone who knew the exact frequency of the jammer. Someone who knew Saran's favorite chair. He stood up slowly, the disheveled suit jacket discarded, his loosened tie looking like a fraying lifeline. He moved toward the advance team lead, his presence a suffocating weight that suggested he owned the very air the man was breathing. The soldier didn't flinch, his expression a mask of practiced calm, but his hand twitched, a micro-movement that the enraged strategist caught instantly. "You were the one who suggested the staggered formation at the ballroom," Jae-hyuk whispered, leaning in until their foreheads almost touched. "You created the blind spot. You turned my own tactical precision into a cage for my daughter." The silence in the vehicle was a death sentence. The trader's eyes shifted, a momentary crack in the clinical efficiency of the vanguard, and in that heartbeat, the truth was laid bare. He hadn't been bought by a rival syndicate, he had been bought by the machine, the lieutenants who believed Jae-hyuk's paternal love was a structural failure they had to excise. Jae-hyuk didn't roar. He didn't reach for his holster. Instead, he reached out and gripped the man's throat with a large, scarred hand, his thumb pressing into the pulse point with a quiet, lethal power. "Where is she?" The traitor gasped, the raw, emotional defiance in Jae-hyuk's gaze finally shattering his robotic resolve. The bridge of secrets had collapsed, leaving only the burning reality of the war. As the first name fell from the traitor's lips, Jae-hyuk's grip tightened. He had found the leak. The monster was dead, and the father was now the only law left in the city. The vanguard was no longer a wall, it was a target. Jae-hyuk stepped back, tucked the yellow toy truck into his waistband, and signaled the lead rifleman. The hunt was no longer citywide. It was surgical. And it would be bloody. The rain had turned the soot and debris into a slick, black sludge by the time Kang Jae-hyuk reached the industrial perimeter of the old shipyard. This was the eye of the needle, a labyrinth of rusted steel and narrow corridors where his superior numbers and heavy artillery meant nothing. Jae-hyuk moved through the shadows with a predatory stillness, his white shirt now a phantom gray, his loosened tie snagging on the jagged edges of a world he was prepared to tear apart. Behind him, the lead rifleman was a silent shadow, but the air felt thin, poisoned by the knowledge that the advance team waiting inside were the very men who had eaten at his table. The infiltration was a masterclass in high-stakes tension. Every creak of a crane, every rhythmic drip of water against a hollow barrel, felt like a countdown. Jae-hyuk didn't use the radio, he didn't need a frequency that could be jammed. He moved by instinct, guided by the phantom weight of the yellow toy truck pressed against his ribs. He breached the central warehouse not with a roar, but with a clinical, terrifying quiet, slipping through a side vent that ignored the clinical efficiency of the trader's defensive perimeter. Inside, the warehouse was a cathedral of iron and betrayal. The advance team stood in their synchronized, staggered formation under the harsh glare of halogen work lights. They looked perfect, unbreakable, until Jae-hyuk stepped into the light. The enraged strategist didn't hide. He stood at the center of the kill zone, his handgun held with a disciplined, downward grip, his expression one of raw, emotional defiance. The gala was a business mistake, the lead trader called out, his voice echoing through the hollow space. But this is a necessary evolution. A leader who cries over a toy cannot rule a city of concrete. The shootout didn't begin with a command, it began with the heartbeat of a father. As the first muzzle flash illuminated the dark, Jae-hyuk moved like the eye of the storm. He didn't fire with the cold precision of a soldier, he fired with the visceral roar of a man reclaiming his soul. The air became a war zone of lead and splintering wood. Jae-hyuk utilized the environment as if it were an extension of his own rage, ducking behind heavy machinery as the higher power of the helicopter overhead shattered the skylights, showering the combatants in a rain of diamond dust glass. He was facing his own men, the wall he had built to protect himself, and he was dismantling it brick by bloody brick. Every shot he took was a rejection of the machine. He wasn't just clearing a path to Saran, he was executing the part of himself that had ever believed power was worth more than the warmth of a child's hand. Amidst the fire and the screaming metal, Jae-hyuk saw a flash of yellow ribbon near a heavy steel door at the back. The monolith of iron didn't just crack, it exploded. He surged forward, ignoring the crimson blossoming on his shoulder, focused entirely on the final outcome. The strategist was gone. Only the father remained, and he was coming for his daughter. The shipyard was no longer a place of industry, it had become a cathedral of fire and screaming lead. The heavy, rhythmic thrum of the Black Hawk helicopter overhead acted as a relentless drumbeat to the carnage, its spotlight cutting through the oily smoke in frantic, searching sweeps. Kang Jae-hyuk stood at the center of the loading bay, a man who had become the very eye of the storm. His white shirt was tattered and stained with a mixture of soot and his own blood, but he held his handgun with a disciplined, downward grip that suggested he was commanding the air itself. Before him stood the remains of his advance team, the clinical, robotic soldiers who had been his wall. They were no longer protecting him, they were the final barricade between a father and his child. They moved in their synchronized, staggered formations, firing with a cold efficiency that had once been Jae-hyuk's greatest pride. But tonight, that precision was a hollow shell. Jae-hyuk met their fire not with tactical logic, but with a visceral, vocal roar that tore through the sound of the engines above. He wasn't a strategist anymore. He was a force of nature. The environmental characters of the shipyard, the towering iron cranes and rusted shipping containers, became weapons in his hands. He used the terrain with a desperate, raw ingenuity, flanking his own men by moving through the shadows of the machinery they had taught him to master. Every time a muzzle flash illuminated his face, it revealed an expression of raw, emotional defiance, less like a cold killer and more like a leader who had been pushed past his absolute limit. The higher power of the state surveillance watched from above as the sovereign of the underworld systematically dismantled his own empire. With every shot, Jae-hyuk wasn't just neutralizing a traitor, he was tearing down the era of the monster. He ignored the stinging spray of concrete dust and the whistle of near misses, his focus entirely anchored to the heavy steel door at the far end of the bay. The air was suffocating, heavy with the scent of ozone and the weight of a power that had finally turned inward. As the last of the vanguard fell back, their clinical formation broken by the sheer, unyielding weight of a father's rage, Jae-hyuk didn't pause to celebrate. He didn't reach for his radio. He simply kept moving, his boots heavy on the blood-slicked metal, a monolith of iron and secrets finally breaking apart. The war zone was his own creation, but as he reached the door, he knew the final outcome was the only thing that could ever buy his peace. He wasn't looking for a kingdom anymore, he was looking for a little girl and a yellow toy truck. The steel door groaned as it swung open, revealing a small, windowless office that felt like a tomb in the heart of the shipyard. There, huddled in a corner behind a stack of moth-eaten moving blankets, was a splash of color that the gray world had tried to swallow. Saran was shaking, her small hands over her ears to block out the thunder of the war zone outside, but as the silhouette of the man in the doorway blocked the flickering halogen light, she looked up. Kang Jae-hyuk stood frozen. The enraged strategist was gone, replaced by a man whose heart was finally beating too fast for his chest to contain. His handgun, the heavy iron tool that had defined his sovereignty for a decade, felt like a lead weight, a poisonous thing that had no place in this sanctuary. With a deliberate, clattering sound that echoed louder than any gunshot, Jae-hyuk discarded his weapon, letting it slide across the concrete floor into the shadows. He didn't need it anymore. The war was over, and the only territory left to claim was the 3 feet of space between him and his daughter. "Appa," she whispered, her voice a tiny, fragile thread in the silence. Jae-hyuk didn't say a word, he couldn't. His throat was tight with a raw, emotional defiance against the very life he had built. He dropped to his knees, ignoring the searing pain in his wounded shoulder and the debris that bit into his skin. He reached out with his large, scarred hands that had spent the night tearing a city apart, and Saran lunged forward, burying her face in the soot-stained fabric of his white shirt. As he gathered her into his arms, lifting her small, light frame against his chest, he felt the yellow toy truck in his waistband press against her. It was the silent evidence of his failure and the singular catalyst for his redemption. He stood up, turning his back on the machine and the broken remains of his vanguard. He walked through the shipyard, carrying her through a field of fire and shattered glass, his posture no longer a fortress of iron secrets but a living shield of flesh and bone. The higher power of the helicopter spotlight followed them, illuminating a broken man who had finally found his humanity. He wasn't a boss, a legend, or a monster anymore. As he stepped out into the rain, shielding Saran's eyes from the devastation, he was simply a father, reaching for a future that no longer belonged to the shadows. The morning light broke over the city not with the harsh glare of a spotlight, but with a soft, restorative glow that seemed to wash away the soot of the previous night. The war zone had finally fallen silent, the rhythmic thrum of the Black Hawk helicopters replaced by the distant, peaceful chirping of birds and the gentle hum of a city waking up to a new reality. Kang Jae-hyuk stood in the center of a quiet garden, his posture no longer a fortress of iron tension, but something more grounded and open. He had traded his sharp, blood-stained suit for a simple sweater, and his large, scarred hands were no longer wrapped around a weapon. Instead, they were steady as he watched Saran push her yellow toy truck through a bed of fresh mulch. The era of the monster had officially ended in the fires of the shipyard, but from its ashes, something far more resilient had emerged. Jae-hyuk had dismantled the syndicate, stripping away the layers of fear and secrecy that had once defined his existence. He realized that the greatest empire he could ever build wasn't one of concrete and blood, but one of safety and presence. The man of stone had not just fractured, he had been recast as a protector. Nearby, the remains of his vanguard stood watch, but their rigid, professional contrast had softened. They were no longer a wall designed to keep the world out, they had been repurposed into a specialized security firm dedicated to the city's most vulnerable. The lead rifleman, once a shadow in the rubble, now coordinated logistics for a local youth center, using his tactical precision to ensure that no other child would ever become a ghost in the system. They were still a vanguard, but their mission was now rooted in the very humanity they had once viewed as a structural failure. As Jae-hyuk looked at the yellow toy truck, he saw it not as evidence of a crime, but as a symbol of the ultimate truth, that strength is not found in the ability to destroy, but in the courage to be vulnerable. He had learned that a leader's true value is measured by the peace he can provide to those who cannot defend themselves. The higher power of the state had retreated, satisfied that the sovereign had stepped down, leaving behind a man who finally understood that his daughter's laughter was the only kingdom worth ruling. The eye of the storm had passed, leaving in its wake a sanctuary built on the simple, profound promise of a father to his child. The search was over, and for the first time in his life, Jae-hyuk was finally home.